I'd like to throw just one thing in, somewhat coming back to, where, if actually there was a report that I thought was interesting that came in through our website. A woman named Lainey Rubenstein, she is our liaison to the United Nations, and also she's a Danish woman. She was given a report of the trip that she just made to China recently, and she had gone in, and some of our Chinese contacts in the academic communities let her come in and teach classes, right? And she was just stunned at the level of optimism that you have in the Chinese youth. And she was just thinking, like, 15 years ago, with the poverty that exists in China and so forth, that didn't exist. But now you have this thing, and she was referencing, I forget exactly what, but it was the normal time it takes to get from the university to where some of these students live. Like, up until they built the high-speed rail that they just did, it was 4 hours or something. And it's been snapped down to a half hour. And so there's this sense that she noted amongst the youth there, where there's just this unbounded potential, this sort of like raw optimism that she was just stunned by it, right?
Yeah, I've been on the Chinese rail systems. Mm-hmm. They're on time. They're great.
Mm-hmm. But the point is that here we are. LaRouche has identified that the future of the world is going to be the so-called the four powers: Russia, China, India, and the United States. And that an alliance based on this kind of development that we've discussed with NAWAPA, the kind of rail, and I was just thinking of it. We were going around talking to some of the engineering and construction firms in the area here, and we walked into this one firm, and the secretary was like, oh, well, it's really interesting. I'd love to have the engineers come out and chat with you, but they're all on a deadline right now. And you can see them in there. You look in, you see these engineers in this sort of like a little lobby thing, right? And they're all looking stressed out. And I said, well, what's the deadline about? And she says, well, they're building, or there's designs for a reactor in China, right? And meanwhile, all the firm does basically is vitrification, is that what you call it? The glass for the waste here. Like no designs of plants or nuclear reactors here, but for China they've got deadlines, right? I just thought that was sort of telling that Asia is moving in this direction. They're oriented more towards what used to be known as the American system, which was this kind of development projects, right? And so, in some ways, that is the future if there's going to be one, this four powers concept.
I'll call back later. I'm in a meeting.
And what Hal has done the work on with the Bering Straits and the potential that represents. And I'd like to bring it up that, we're at the point where the whole Euro system could blow. The whole inter-alpha banking system, this syndicate of these mega banks of Europe, are on the verge of complete collapse. And they can drag us down with them, but we're at a point where what seems to be impossible around, say, NAWAPA or something, where people go, it's just too grand, that's the future. And we're at a point where that is becoming rapidly the only alternative to this dying, dead, rotted system. So I think it's much more close in one sense than we may think. And that we should just take this opportunity now to just let this system crash, or let this British imperial system crash, and fight for what NAWAPA represents, fight for these development projects is the only way out.
We've all, one time or another, probably played poker. When you play poker, you wonder how many chips you have on the table. right now you ask, well, how many chips does the USA have? Well, they're rather small, quite small, but this NAWAPA is this column of chips.
That's exactly right.
Use that in that advantage.
David, along the lines of what you just said, I don't know how many of you are aware of an announcement that this was made, and I actually saw it on the internet in the China Daily newspaper, English version, of course. China announced that it is announced that it is going to finance and build new high-speed rail lines from Kunming in southwestern China, which is on the south side of the Himalayan mountains, to Vientiane in Laos, to Phnom Penh in Cambodia, to Singapore, which they had already announced. They were going to connect to the line that's being proposed between Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi in Vietnam, and they're going to be building to Yangon, which is the former Rangoon in Myanmar and Burma, and they're going to be building a high-speed rail line to New Delhi in India, Lahore in Pakistan, right through the middle of the area where there's this conflict in Baluchistan in southwestern Pakistan, to Tehran to join in with the rail system there. And they reiterated their announcement and their intention to build a high-speed rail line, all standard gauge, from Beijing to London by a yet-to-be-identified route. To London. Well, they would obviously connect to the European rail system, the high-speed rail system in the eastern part of Germany. Poland wants to build one, but again, you've got to address the question of the gauge, and I'm sure if China's putting up the money, they're not going to tolerate gauge changes at the borders with the former Soviet republics.
I might say I found that release on the internet, and basically it's a conference between the Chinese and the Russians over the last 2 weeks, and they ended up with 12 different areas, of which one of the 12 is probably that railroad.
Yes, right.
Nuclear reactors is one.
Yeah.
And they agreed on all of this in an inter-trade agreement
Right.
between Russia and China, and they all agreed that all the transactions would not be on the dollar.
Right.
And they defined what currencies they were going
Right.
to use.
Yes. And along with what you said on the nuclear side, China has agreed, I believe, to buy 6 reactors from Rosatom, the Russian nuclear energy supplier. They're the equivalent of the French Ariba.
Well, that's why the crisis lies in the United States not understanding its own identity,
Right.
because we would not tolerate this kind of self-looting process that we've gone for the benefit of the empire over the past decades. If we had the self-dignity to identify with that history, which is our rightful inheritance of the preceding generations, which is that we have no limitation on what we can do. Look, we were the first country to be connected by rail, continent. We were the first sovereign nation state to have the sovereignty over our population, right? To even have private property to bicker over, because we actually had ownership of our own things versus a monarch or some empire. We were the first country then to do every major technological development. And as I said in my presentation, even our water wheels were the most advanced in the world. But then every other advancement, we were the first to do this, the first to do that, the first to get to the moon. And it's this unique, see, even though there's this agreement between Russia and China, the point is right now, there's no way you're going to have a complete disintegration of the whole transatlantic system and the US dollar, and there's going to be some future. Forget about it. And that's why the deterioration, the attrition of the ability to support 6.7 billion people on the planet right now, the technological potential collapse. I pointed out in my presentation this problem from the standpoint of a 40-year generational problem. But the other problem is that the physical reality is that the potential to rebuild, that is actually deteriorated. You have actuality and you have potential. We have the actuality right now is that we can support 6.7 billion people. But the potential to do that is actually not there. And so as these things catch up, we have a necessary decrease in the world population. As Hal pointed out, that's been intended by Prince Philip of the World Wildlife Fund. They openly want to depopulate the planet to less than 2 billion people. If we don't bridge this generational gap and build this now, that's a guaranteed state, because there's no way that we can do it uniquely from the United States, because we have the unique ability to organize a global fixed exchange rate system with the history of our credit system. Russia doesn't have that. I looked at the Russian constitution. They don't have the ability to issue bills of credit off of the nation. They have to gather up money.
The ruble's not worth anything either.
And President Putin actually said in 2008, when these bailouts were going on, he said, "We Russians, we're not like the Americans. We can't just print money. They have to sell resources, other things out of the ground to gather up money, and then with that money they can do it. It's in accord with this foreign interest. Now, an external foreign interest that regulates the economy is only, it's a reflection, it's an expression of the lack of internal authority. And if we remember our internal authority as the sovereign nation state of the planet, we'll have no need for this external system. And we can do exactly as Lyndon LaRouche has put forward, a project that can overcome this tide that we've fell into, and achieve what Dave had said.
Which president said the business of the United States is business?
Calvin Coolidge in 1924.
Calvin Coolidge. I agree with that.
Well, let me just add another point. Is that what I just presented was a question of necessity, and there could be no lack of understanding and clarity that we can present on the necessity to do this project. But let me just say that the other practical fork here, if we want to look at the two ways to apply this this concept to real application and implementation, is not just necessity, but also something more on the lines of immortality. That the reason to do a project like this is not just that we're in a crisis, but in fact, with a project like this, we move ourselves in a position where we come back to remembering that we're in the space age. We've been to the moon, right? We can look at the planet and managing it as a whole. And with these global projects, we can begin to organize the scientific capability to look at the planet as a planet, like we'd look at the moon as the moon, or Mars as Mars. We wouldn't develop like one crater on Mars if we went to Mars. We'd manage the planet by studying its characteristics as a whole. This puts us in a position again to not just go back to FDR's era of projects, or not just back to nuclear power or the space age, but being able to conceive projects, being able to conceive the human civilization on these scales, where the common citizen is, as Dave had referenced, instilled with the power of optimism through seeing the technological advancements around him, but also capable of conceiving in their mind a whole project like this. And to reinvigorate all of the scientific layers of the United States, which are not able to do anything for the sake of human economy. The application of science in its true form is to improve the living standards of the population. Abstract science for the sake of more things that are more related to sci-fi which seemingly magical technologies that are never usable. That's not real science. So we have to bring these science and economics back into application, which is what I said today in my presentation. The true measurement of a scientific economic plan, which is what we need now, not a monetarist plan. That doesn't work. Is this kind of project. Yeah?
The National Energy Plan being advanced by both Republicans and Democrats and whoever has got a wind and solar and bio program emphasis with hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidy going to it as we speak. it only generates a 20% energy return efficiency.
Or less.
While there's no gradient measure on energy efficiencies that the economy should be moving to.
Sure.
And I understand this goes right back to the level that you're talking about, Lucius advocating the collapse, da-da-da-da. And, you know, that has happened, you know, in many financial sectors already. I guess if we were to go back, rule of America is still 50 plus 1. And if you're going to arrive at a somewhat of a majority, unless you have the herd mentality with the financial collapse, TARP, and others going on, you had nothing going on there but total chaos. What would you do to go back to the inner city, for example, to capture hearts and minds of people that need to be in this party? When energy costs go through the roof, the poor people in the inner cities are the ones that freeze to death, don't have the jobs, don't have a way out. And if you take Obama's planning, promising you can all go back to the plantation and arrive there with solutions which frankly are collapsing on everybody. So what do you do to go to the inner city to show people a way out with real jobs, real economic opportunity that would turn around where the masses are headed right now? Because they're not headed in that direction.
Yeah, I have a response to that, but if you had a comment first, you want
Yeah.
to.
One of the things to do is proper education. If you go to the inner city, you go down to Los Angeles, California, and you ask the little Mexican kids in class there where lumber comes from, they'll tell you Home Depot. And where does paper come from? Office Max. And where does milk come from? Safeway. Nobody has any idea of the resource origin of those commodities, and in many cases, teachers don't either, and I think this is in part because of the green response and that sort of thing. So you know, and so education is key, and to get to that, you got to get to the teachers. To get to the teachers, you got to tell them that lumber doesn't come from Home Depot; it comes from trees. You know, and gasoline doesn't come from the service station; it comes from the ground.
From Exxon, companies,
Yeah.
warehouses.
Yeah.
World at Shell.
Yeah, well, the entire, I mean, most people don't realize that they're sitting next to this big inland waterway right here in Kennewick, right? The ability for all of these things that come to people as individuals depends on something that was created over a long period of time, infrastructure, really. And so that, you know, people, if they're conscious of that again, they realize they can hold all this in their mind as a citizen, then you have a sense of the importance of the thing. But the other thing is this: how do you address the inner cities? The issue is not to go into the cities. Right? We have a website in which the idea right now is, you had mentioned the technological intelligentsia, and maybe you have something more to say about that.
No, they're all
But,
here. That's what I have to say.
But these are the leadership.
Including you.
The people who can be the leadership of their constituents are no longer the elected officials at this present moment, because they're entirely gripped by the cultural axioms which have led us into this crisis. Mm-hmm. Now that doesn't exclude you guys or the skilled, not just the working class, but the skilled labor of the United States also has certain restricted beliefs in different monetarism, other things like that. But with a project like this, to speak to to be the leaders of your states, right? To rise to be the people who can represent the citizenry. That's the idea. And we are the way to speak to the general citizen is through our website, where we were putting a forum, conferences like this across the country. This is only in the first set of these conferences. But as I said before, that we want to have a team which is ready to implement this program at the drop of a hat. But throughout the entire process, fighting politically to make sure that it occurs. And the best way to do that is our website as the forum in which the kind of discussion that occurred today, but also speaking to the citizen on this is what your future would look like.